Hello everyone, this is Lindsay, and in this video, we're going to talk about getting our apps out into the world. So when we talk about how to share our apps with other people, there are several things we need to think about when we're assessing the various options. We need to think about how many apps we're going to be putting up total and what kind of hosting time they need. We're going to think about the cost that it's going to cost us to host on various services, um, and whether that's something that we can build into grant funding. We need to think about our audience's level of R skills and whether solutions that require people to know some R are accessible for what we need. And we need to assess our own IT skills because some of the ways that we get Shiny apps out into the world require us to have some computer skills beyond just writing Shiny and R code. There's one more big consideration we need to think about, and this is really important, which is why it gets its own slide. And that's whether you're going to need to have control over the server where the app is hosted or not. And this came up in our discussions about the workshop because of something that had happened to Dennis, where his university was really particular about where identifiable data was stored. And this is something that quite often comes up in relation to things like sensitive species data in an IACUC or individually identifiable data about people in an IRB. And so when we're deciding how to disperse our Shiny app out into the world, we need to think about whether some of the data in it is sensitive and whether our home institutions and permitting agencies are going to have thoughts about where that data can live and how accessible it can be to people. So when we think about how to share our Shiny apps with other people, we really have two fundamental avenues. Either we can directly share our code, or we can share our app by hosting it somewhere online and then sharing it as a web page. So first, we're going to talk about a few different options for making Shiny apps into web pages, which is probably what most people had pictured when they signed up for the course. So we're going to talk about a few different options for hosting Shiny apps as web pages, and we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each option. The simplest way to get a Shiny app out into the world is to host it on shinyapps.io, which is a web hosting service provided by RStudio. And we'll go into some more depth in a subsequent video about how exactly we do this. But overall, this is the smoothest and easiest way to get an app out into the world. So now we're going to talk about some of the pluses, the advantages, and the minuses, the disadvantages of hosting with shinyapps.io. The advantages are that this is really just a smooth and easy way to get our apps on the internet. We deploy right from RStudio. The deployment process is really easy. We can either do it from the console, the command line, or with a point and click interface, and I'll show you how to do that in our next video. It's free up to 5 apps and 26 active hours a month. And very importantly, your audience doesn't need any R skills. So this is just sort of like the nice, smooth, built-in way to get your app out in the world. Some of the disadvantages are that, like I said, you only get up to 5 apps on the free version, and you get a limited amount of hosting time for those apps. And the costs for the additional hosting time can build up kind of quickly. And we'll link to resources where you can see the types of pricing options that are available in our resources page on our website. So the TLDR, which is the too long didn't read, or the short summary on shinyapps.io, is that it's great. It's super easy to use, and I would totally recommend it if you have a limited number of apps or you anticipate a limited number of user hours per month, or if you have some funding for paying for web hosting. The next deployment option we're going to talk about is Shiny Server. So Shiny Server is an application that you install on a server and then you host your Shiny app from that server. And again, we'll include some detailed instructions on how to do this on our resources page. The trick with Shiny Server is that you have to have a Linux server. And this can be really tricky because a lot of universities don't have Linux servers, they have Windows servers. So that means that even if your institution has the capability to host things on its institutional websites, uh, it might not be able to host Shiny apps because of the Linux requirement. But if you are fortunate enough to have access to a Linux server, you can work with your department's IT folks to host an app right on a department or an institution website. The other option, and this is where I was talking about it being helpful if we have some IT skills, is that you can open a remote server using a service like DigitalOcean, where you can host a Shiny app off a cloud server. And cloud servers are really affordable in terms of the number of active hours per dollar that you get. So if you have a little bit of IT chops, this might be a good way to go for you. So if we sum up the pluses and minuses of using Shiny Server or RStudio Connect, which is its up and coming cousin, we get a lot of control over the server, which can be great for those instances where a funding agency or permitting agency is going to be really picky about how secure our data is. It can be more affordable to deploy apps and user hours at large scales, and our audience still doesn't need any R skills. So this is still our web page version where our audience is just engaging with that HTML output. The big challenge is that we're going to need either some IT knowledge ourselves or some IT support from our institution. And I think that it's pretty doable to teach yourself how to use a cloud server service. Um, but I think the question is more so whether if you don't have the institutional support, whether you have the time to develop these skills or not. But I'd say that it's at least worth taking a look at. So our TLDR on Shiny servers slash RStudio Connect is that it's great for when you need more hosting time and either have some IT chops yourself or IT support at your university and a little bit of money for hosting or a physical Linux server. So next we're going to move on to chatting about some options for code sharing. And we really have a lot of different levels of engagement here. So the first and simplest option is to just share the code. So you can share the code exactly the way that we've been doing for you in this course, where you just bundle up your code and any source files and functions and data, and then just either zip it up like that if it's a big app, and then you can share it to people via any number of online repositories, or you can actually host your app on GitHub and just upload all of the files to GitHub. So you can probably predict what the advantages and disadvantages to this approach are going to be. It's easy for us because if we've already written an app, we can share it with people, and it's mostly going to be free for any service that we would store it on. It gives us a nice built-in utility for documentation because we can include those sorts of data cleaning files if we want to, and we can include a nice README which explains how everything works inside the app. And if somebody's downloading our app, that means that they can have offline access to it. Some of the challenges is that this is the code sharing option that's going to require our audience to need the highest level of R skills. So the real challenge and the danger here is that if you just hand somebody a chunk of Shiny code with its data like this, they are likely going to need to know how to troubleshoot a bit on their own. So this might put you in a position if you share apps this way that you might end up having to walk somebody through a number of different levels of troubleshooting. So this is sort of like a buyer beware situation. I would really only share apps like this for development purposes, not for long-term deployment purposes, because we have some better options. So our TLDR on just sharing our code is that it's good for when you want to quickly share something, especially simple apps, and your audience is R savvy. Or you're working in a course like this where we can chat with folks and help them through all their troubleshooting. The next option that I want to talk through with sharing our code and deploying our code is to share it as an R package. And I mentioned this briefly in my last video, but we can actually structure Shiny apps as R packages with just a little bit of extra work. And this is really nice because giving our Shiny apps the package structure means that they also get the dependency structure. So that'll give us an extra layer of automation and troubleshooting for the user, because it'll do things like prompt them to install packages that aren't installed if they need that. So some of our advantages and disadvantages to deploying our Shiny apps as an R package are that we can create a stable environment, which we talked about briefly with the RN package or REN package. Um, our apps become readily deployable because we can use features like install GitHub, which help users get them offline. It's really great for research applications because this means that we can share code data, cleaning files, etc., all in one unit. And it means that once somebody's downloaded the package, it'll be accessible offline. Some of our disadvantages are pretty predictable, which is that our audience is still going to need some R skills. So they're going to need to be relatively confident with R. And we are going to need some limited package development skills. Personally, I don't think this is really a downside though, because having a basic knowledge of R package development is a fantastic skill. So I'm going to walk you through how to do this in a subsequent video. But I actually think this route is a really great thing to explore because it helps you think about Shiny apps, but also think about structuring and deploying code at large. So the TLDR on deploying our Shiny apps as R packages is that it's great for research applications because it gives us a way to share a stable environment and nice, neat packages of code and data for an R-savvy audience. The last thing I want to talk about is deploying Shiny apps as desktop apps. So we can actually, using this package called Electroshine, package up our Shiny app and deploy it as a desktop application like Chrome or Microsoft Word or anything else. So this is really neat because it means that we get all those advantages of deploying our app as an R package, but our audience doesn't need any R skills. It'll just be a point and click experience. The challenge here is obviously that we're still going to need some package development skills, but no worse than our previous option. And this is sort of the big disadvantage that unfortunately this approach is only currently available for Windows. So that's kind of a bummer. But overall, I think that developing desktop applications is sort of a nice kind of R native way to distribute things offline, and we'll walk through how to do that in one of our next videos here. So I want to finish up by having a chat about long-term maintenance. So as folks have already sort of started to figure out during the course, we're going to need to have a long-term life plan for our app. So because people are constantly moving around in science, we need to be thinking about if we leave, who's going to take charge of our app? And are we sending them enough documentation so that they can keep running the app as long as it needs to run and fix things once they break down? We also need to think about where our data is going to be stored. If your data is permitted to be stored in a certain place for a certain period of time, do you have a plan for safety and security and backups? And are we making sure that we've done things like masking and de-identifying? Where's our app going to live long term? Sometimes it makes sense to have an app hosted on shinyapps.io with the paid service for its first year, because that's when we expect it to get a lot of engagement. But maybe you want to step down that engagement over time. Are we going to need to update our app? As some folks have already suggested, when new data comes along, we need to have a maintenance schedule for building it into the app if that's important. And sort of wrapping up here, with products like this, sometimes we need to think about plans to see through the end of their life. So if our app has a defined purpose and it meets that purpose, are we going to have a plan for retiring it in a controlled way so that we make sure that people are going to find whatever data product we have next to work on that problem? And finally, this is something that I want to think about, kind of thinking about this overall full lifespan of apps, from conception to development to use and eventual retirement, are we building our apps into our research plans? So if we're applying for something like an NSF grant where we have a broader impact statement, are we making provisions so that we can do all these sorts of responsible things over our app's lifetime by adequately funding ourselves to either get hosting time or get ourselves the skills to host our apps? Just thinking of Shiny Apps as not something that we tack on at the end of the project, but something that we build in as a communication strategy throughout the project and anticipate and plan for throughout their lives. So I hope in this discussion of our deployment options here, we've learned how to think about uh, both the concrete advantages and disadvantages of our different distribution options, and also how to think about some of our own needs in terms of communication strategies and our audience's skill sets and our own skill sets and costs. So thanks everyone for listening, and I'm excited to see all your apps get out in the world.